The fury in France on this Friday night. Protests and violence over a teen's death at the hands of police. Will calls for calm be answered as authorities make hundreds of arrests? More setbacks by the U.S. Supreme Court. Why there are growing fears it's enabling discrimination after its latest ruling targets gay rights. A BC town's somber anniversary. How Lytton is still picking up the pieces 2 years after the inferno that took everything. Finding pride on the prairies.
One of my hopes is that one day everyone here can exist, can be themselves.
The efforts to help LGBTQ2+ people fight prejudice in small-town Alberta.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Neetu Garcha.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. Heavy rioting in France has prompted President Emmanuel Macron to ask parents to keep their teenagers indoors tonight as the country braces for what could be another round of violence. Protests have spread across the country since the fatal police shooting of a 17-year-old. Since then, some 45,000 police officers have been deployed to try and restore order. 875 arrests were made on Thursday night alone. Although officers are the source of much of the anger, French police unions are pushing back, telling the government they are at war. As France burns, Macron is also taking aim at social media companies, saying they're fueling the rioting on the streets. Redmond Shannon has tonight's top story on the desperate attempts to stop the escalating unrest.
On Friday, there was no sign of calm on many of the streets of France, just more violence and looting, hogging attention from other more peaceful protests. All of them spreading further from the Paris suburb, where on Tuesday police shot and killed a 17-year-old known as Naël. President Emmanuel Macron left an EU summit in Brussels early to hold a crisis meeting in Paris. He said parents need to take responsibility and keep their teens off the streets. Also asking some social media platforms to remove videos of looting and extreme violence. Macron says they only encourage copycat behaviour. His interior minister has asked regions to ban the sale of fireworks and gas cans. All buses and streetcars have stopped for the night too, measures that are unlikely to quell the anger toward police.
Nothing much has changed. Despite all the talk of reform, despite all of the promises, not much has changed.
Echoing the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020, activists say visible minorities are the victims of too many deaths involving French police.
Beyond institutional racism, French policing has always had the tendency to be more violent compared to some of its neighbors in Europe.
The officer charged with the killing has issued an apology to Naël's family. His lawyer argues the killing was not intentional. But police unions are not holding out any olive branches. On Tuesday, a smaller union tweeted, "Bravo to our colleagues who opened fire on a 17-year-old criminal." Its account has since been suspended. And on Friday, a major police union said its officers are now at war against what it calls hordes of savages, threatening a resistance unless police get more support. Macron's government now appears to be stuck between protesters and police, both of whom say they are not being listened to. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
And the federal government is urging Canadian travellers to France to exercise a high degree of caution due to the elevated threat of terrorism. With further demonstrations planned, officials say there is a risk even peaceful demonstrations can turn violent at any time. The U.S. Supreme Court has rolled back anti-discrimination laws for LGBTQ2+ Americans and potentially other minority groups. The ruling centered around a Christian web designer who wanted to refuse service to same-sex couples on religious grounds. As Jackson Proskow reports, legal experts warn the court's decision could take the U.S. back to a time where businesses had the right to refuse service to some.
Though she has never created websites for weddings, Colorado web designer Lori Smith went to the U.S. Supreme Court to fight the hypothetical, arguing she should be protected from ever having to make web pages for same-sex ceremonies, while being able to advertise her refusal to serve certain clients.
Whether your views on marriage are similar to mine or perhaps different, nobody should be forced to create a message that goes against his or her convictions.
The conservative-leaning court agreed. By a 6-3 margin, it pierced Colorado's anti-discrimination law, saying Smith has a right to free speech and cannot be forced to create messages she does not believe.
It is clear this decision is not limited to one group, LGBTQ individuals. It's not limited to one type of expressive service, a website.
Conservatives call it a clear win for religious freedom. Opponents fear the court has legalized widespread discrimination in a throwback to a dark time in American history.
You could put a sign on the front door that says same-sex married people shall not apply. There are any number of things people may believe about the sinfulness of their potential customers that would lead them to want to turn them away.
The court put few guardrails on the type of business or the type of legally objectionable grounds for discrimination, a slippery slope.
I think there are lots of companies that can claim to have expressive elements to their goods and services.
5 years ago, the court ruled narrowly in favor of a Colorado baker who refused to create a wedding cake for a gay couple. Only now has it undone anti-discrimination protections in law, part of a recent trend of rolling back rights, including access to abortion.
I think we're seeing threats to democracy in a lot of the court's decisions.
As the court signals its willingness to revisit established rights, there is concern that other key rulings will soon be tested, including the legality of same-sex marriage in the United States. Neetu?
Okay, Jackson Proskow in Washington, thanks. And in another major case, the U.S. Supreme Court has blocked President Joe Biden's plan to forgive $430 billion U.S. in student loan debt. In a 6-3 decision favoring conservative-leaning states, the court ruled it's an overreach of authority. The plan was one of Biden's campaign promises and would have benefited up to 43 million Americans. Biden pledges to move forward with a different student debt relief plan. In Ottawa, there is fallout over two tech giants' plans to block Canadian news. Meta and Google are pushing back on the federal government's attempt to help the struggling media industry in Canada. Mackenzie Gray reports on the new regulations and how the deadlock might end.
Finding out what's happening in your community could soon get a little harder, with Facebook, Instagram, and Google all saying they won't post Canadian news.
This is really important, not just for the news industry, but for democracy, for our country.
At issue, the recently passed Online News Act, which will force tech giants to cut deals with media publishers for sharing and directing users to online news content. The Parliamentary Budget Officer estimates it would cost Meta and Google roughly $300 million annually. But the Silicon Valley giants won't play ball. Google saying the plan creates uncertainty for our products and exposes us to uncapped financial liability. The company concerned it could cut into the $5.8 billion in revenue they made in Canada last year.
This is a very lucrative market for them. They dominate the digital ad market, and folks who consume news content are good users.
The CRTC will soon start consultations on the specific regulations under the Act, and until the new rules are in place, Google and Meta won't block Canadian content. But it's not just the tech giants that are concerned. Many smaller news organizations want to make sure they're compensated properly when the regulations are put in place.
Independent media is going to have to really fight to be sure that we do get a proportional share of the funding.
Meta and Google blocked news for nearly a week in Australia when Canberra brought in similar online news laws, but they did reach a deal. California is now considering comparable legislation, and experts believe that's impacting the tech giants' choices here in Canada.
There's no doubt that what happens in one country is seen by those tech giants as precedent and or pattern for other countries.
Despite potential lost revenue, Canadian media organizations, including Global News, will continue to publish journalism every single day, Neetu, even if it's not on Google.
All right, Mackenzie Gray in Ottawa. Thanks, Mackenzie. Both Toronto and Montreal once again cracked the top 5 cities with the worst air quality in the world today. Special weather statements are in place for much of Quebec and southern Ontario as officials urge people to reduce their exposure to the haze as much as possible. Although some rain and thunderstorms are forecast in the region tonight, the smoke is expected to linger well into tomorrow. As hundreds of wildfires burn across the country, one BC community is marking 2 years since their town was destroyed by wildfire. There was a moment of reflection and hope in Lytton today as people gathered to mark the difficult day. Videographer Darren Twiss and I traveled to Lytton earlier this week to get a sense of how some residents living in the few remaining homes are coping.
You miss our property?
I miss it a lot.
Eric Pickard and Marlene Charlie are visiting the still empty plot of land where their home stood.
We got our house in 1986.
Up until 2 years ago when it burned in the devastating fire that tore through Lytton, BC, not long after Eric filmed this video.
Important stuff, and that was, I grabbed 2 pictures. She grabbed some, and that was it. We were out the door. We just try to forget it and remember that June 30th is our daughter's birthday.
Since then, they've lived in temporary housing. They have insurance but are waiting for the go-ahead to start rebuilding their house.
I appreciate what the government's done, I really do, but we have to make it move faster.
Even here at work, we don't have landlines yet.
Laverne Henry and Nina Sidorchuk say some residents lost hope of returning home and have started to build lives elsewhere.
To me, it's sad because there's been a few already that are saying that they're not coming back home.
The village of Lytton was very important for the surrounding area because it's a meeting point of all the surrounding communities within our nation.
Lytton's mayor says even the local bylaws, which weren't backed up electronically, have to be rewritten. She says it will likely be another few years for a full community rebuild, and navigating that process is challenging.
It doesn't work for small communities. We don't have the capacity to manage a recovery on our own.
The mayor has been careful not to give specific timelines, but she says she hopes streets like this one will be lined with some basement foundations for homes by the end of this summer.
As a village now, we are trying to shift from recovery to rebuild, and I think that's a strong message.
And residents have noticed some of the signs of hope in recent days, including the reopening of the sidewalk.
There's just all of these things that are having no progress. So something as small as a security fence keeping us off our properties just being moved back a little is really huge.
The ripple effect of what happened 2 years ago is still being felt.
Remember looking at the fire?
As Eric and Marlene find comfort in the one sentimental piece of their property that survived, this rose bush.
Remember that it can happen to you.
Residents marking this somber anniversary say they just hope their story and ongoing struggle won't be forgotten. Also in BC, the search for a missing teenager who spent 2 nights lost in the woods has ended with good news. 16-year-old Esther Wang got lost hiking with friends in Golden Ears Park on Tuesday. A huge search was launched, and last night, as darkness fell, Esther emerged. But it wasn't the search teams who tracked her down. It turns out she found her own way out.
Esther's obviously a very determined young lady. Where Esther was in the steepness of that terrain, in some situations you end up being in a location where once you go down, it's very difficult to get back up again, and hazardous as well.
Police say the first people Esther saw were her parents waiting in the parking lot. Other than some mosquito bites, she is unharmed. Complicated feelings for Canada Day. Coming up, the evolving sentiment towards celebrating the country's birthday. Canada Day is the kickstart to summer for many people across the country, but exclusive new polling for Global News suggests overall feelings towards a national holiday are changing. According to Ipsos, nearly half of Canadians are changing the way they commemorate July 1st compared to 5 years ago. As Eric Sorensen reports, pride in our national identity is also seeing a shift.
Laura Jimenez moved here 10 years ago and has no complaints about Canada.
I can say I feel very proud to be part of this.
Many are unabashedly proud.
I love this country. I love the immigration. I love just the way it's evolving.
But how people feel is evolving too. The celebrations that at one time fully accepted Canada's colonial past now come with more reflection.
We have to acknowledge the times when we fall short of our goals and objectives.
42% of Canadians say their feeling of pride has changed in the last 5 years. 21% feel more proud, 21% less. The change is mostly generational.
Millennials and Gen Z much more likely to be
re-examining their Canadian identity and their relationship to Canada, boomers much more likely to be maintaining the status quo.
While recent events or politics may have caused some Canadians to feel differently about their pride in this country, for others it's Canada's long history that brings about those questions. The mistreatment of Indigenous people that was long ignored has prompted many to view Canada's identity through a different prism today.
Canadians really have to re-examine what they're celebrating. The privileges that Canadians have for the last 150 years plus comes at the sacrifice to Indigenous peoples.
The Ipsos survey found there is growing awareness. 39% of Canadians are more likely to learn about Indigenous history than 5 years ago. And it jumps to close to half among young Canadians, millennials and Gen Z.
There's much more awareness now, and I think it's really shameful that, that was not part of our education.
That there is greater sensitivity among young people suggests that Canadians' sense of themselves will continue to evolve, while many still believe, on balance, it's a good country.
I don't think we need to feel bad every day, even though it's Canada Day. So I think we can still celebrate, yeah.
Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
Port workers on Canada's west coast serve strike notice. The potential economic impact ahead. Experts are warning of major damage looming for Canada's economy as we inch closer to the strike deadline for thousands of port workers in BC. Some 7,400 workers are set to walk off the job tomorrow morning if no deal is reached tonight. The job action would affect more than 30 ports in the province, including those in Vancouver and in Prince Rupert, both pivotal for Canadian trade. Some $800 million worth of goods flow through BC ports every day. Hollywood actors are on the verge of joining screenwriters in a second labor strike this summer, which could have major implications on the film industry. Studios are racing against a midnight deadline to reach a deal with the union representing actors, which represents 160,000 of them, including artists. A strike would turn up the heat on Hollywood, already grappling with a nearly 2-month work stoppage by the Writers Guild of America. A-list actors say they're ready to walk off the job if negotiators can't reach a deal on pay and the use of artificial intelligence. The entertainment world is mourning the loss of award-winning actor Alan Arkin.
You are the most beautiful girl in the whole world.
Arkin, who won an Oscar for his supporting role in Little Miss Sunshine, is being remembered as a uniquely talented force of nature. The actor was known for his deadpan comic timing. He became famous appearing in films like The Russians Are Coming, The Russians Are Coming, and The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, which earned him Best Actor nominations. Alan Arkin was 89 years old. Next, a big heart for pride in a small Alberta city. The LGBTQ2+ community has been celebrated all June for Pride Month. Rainbow flags and parades are accepted in most big cities, but it's not always the case in rural areas. In central Alberta, the last few months have been hard. Weeks after a provincial election candidate made hateful comments about trans youth, she secured a landslide victory. The local queer community experienced acts of vandalism soon after. But as Heather Urex West explains, in the little city of Lacombe, the spirit of pride is thriving.
In a central Alberta city filled with pickup trucks and small town charm, you'll find a very colorful home, surrounded by rainbow flags that often need replacing. But every time they're stolen, the Kickstra family just puts out more. Sometimes their friends help too.
The first time they stole the big rainbow, it's gone. But we have very wonderful neighbors who replaced it for us.
For Candace Kickstra, it's just part of being a mom.
How was the test?
When 2 of her teenagers came out as queer, the family questioned whether or not they should stay. Lacombe is a little city with well-established conservative values.
I'm out at school, kind of. I'm not very loud at school just because not fantastic all the time.
For Jonathan Lescombe, it hasn't always been the easiest place to be gay.
I only came out in 2021 because of the place I live. When I was young, people shouted the F slur down the street. They shouted, you were kicked out of businesses, you were looked at with utter disgust because of the way you dress.
2 years later, Lescombe is not only out in his city, he tries to be as visible as he can, as the founder and executive director of Lacombe's first Pride Society.
One of my hopes is that one day, again, that everyone here can exist, can be themselves, can feel loved.
But the last few months have shown this community still has a ways to go. In May, a recording surfaced of the local United Conservative Party candidate comparing trans children to feces. Jennifer Johnson was removed from the UCP caucus, but won easily on election day. Days later, the Pride display in nearby Ponoka was vandalized. Alberta RCMP say across the province, hate-motivated incidents against the LGBTQ2+ community are on the rise.
It's not a good feeling. There's just some learning that needs to be done on their part, and the spread of misinformation is just tremendous.
But that's also why the Kickstras ultimately decided to stay, working alongside others like Lescombe to inspire pride on the prairies, to make Lacombe a place everyone can truly call home. Heather Urix-West, Global News, Lacombe, Alberta.
And that is Global National for this Friday. I'm Neetu Garcha. Tonight's Your Canada is Port Coquitlam, BC. We love to see your Canada. Please email it to viewers@globalnational.com. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.